The Second World War turned the globe into a battlefield. Over 80 years later, the war is fast slipping out of living memory, but the remains of that terrible conflict can still be found all around us today. From mega bunkers to bullet holes, shipwrecks to cemeteries. I'm James Rogers, a war historian who is fascinated by these time capsules. They tell us the stories of death and glory, ingenuity and desperation. Now, for the History Hit YouTube channel, I'll be looking for the last traces of World War II. The Allied Invasion of Normandy in June 1944 was one of the most spectacular pieces of military planning in history, with every element planned to the tiniest detail. But one of the biggest problems the Allied planners faced was exactly how to provide the invasion force with the supplies they needed to sustain the assault, and without access to a major French port. The disastrous Dieppe raid in 1942 had showed that capturing a heavily fortified French port would be extremely costly and had absolutely no guarantee of success. And so Allied planners came up with a rather ingenious solution.
Instead of risking the lives of thousands of troops by taking a port like Le Havre or Cherbourg, the Allies decided to bring one with them. And you can still find remnants of that on the beaches of Arromanches.
Arromanches was at the heart of the Gold Invasion beach, but planners spared it from the brunt of the invasion. It would be here that Mulberry B, later known as Port Winston, would be built. But of course it wasn't as simple as digging a few piers into the sand and watching the tanks roll off. To support the scale of the invasion, the harbour would need to be built both on a huge scale and fast. Even as the Allied troops were fighting their way off the beaches in the morning of the 6th of June 1944, the first components of the harbour were being tugged over the channel to Arromanches. And on the 8th, building began. It all started with the enormous breakwater, and I've come up to the cliffs to the west of Arromanches to get a better view. The harbour wall here at Arromanches measured over 5 miles long, and it was made up of these concrete caissons, each 60 metres long and 8 metres wide. The building of the different components of the harbour started at the end of 1943, with the work taking place across the UK from the Thames estuary to the Scottish coast. Once the caissons were made, they were then purposely sunk to keep them out of sight of prying enemy eyes, before being refloated in the days leading up to the invasion. It was this resurrection that gave them their codename Phoenix. But these Phoenix blocks were just a single part of the huge Mulberry operation, and back down on the beach you can find other bits of evidence of the harbour. Standing right here in the middle of the beach, just a few hundred metres from the town centre, is the centrepiece of the remains. This is a huge piece of a pierhead, codenamed Spud. It was on these platforms that men and supplies were unloaded, the first step for many of the invasion. Hundreds of thousands of tons of steel and concrete went into making the Mulberry Harbour, but despite this, the entire harbour is designed to float. It needed to not only support the weight of an army, but also flex with the rising and falling tide. The roadways, codenamed Whales, floated on these massive floats called beetles, and the spuds were hollow. It was, and still is, an astonishing achievement. On the beach today, you can see just a fraction of what would have been here in June 1944. The harbour here was built up of 33 jetties and 10 miles of floating roadway.
Once Port Winston was complete, it rivaled the size of Dover, and it's still considered one of the greatest achievements in military engineering. But what's most amazing is that they didn't just build one, they built two.
Just a few miles down the coast, on the American landing beach of Omaha, at the French town of Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, Mulberry A was built. Less than 2 weeks after the invasion, both the harbours were functional, allowing a steady flow of men and armaments onto the continent. But on the 19th of June, disaster struck when the worst storm in 40 years blew through Normandy. It ripped Mulberry A from the sea floor, leaving it irreparably damaged. Mulberry B, which had slightly better protection from the storm, survived, but only just. Rapid repairs were made, and for the next 10 months, Port Winston landed 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of other supplies. It lasted 7 months longer than expected and was a vital part of the Allied logistical plan.
Once the Mulberry Harbours had reached the end of their operational life, they still had an important role to play, and if you know where to look, you can find parts of them today.
Over the river Noiro, an hour to the south of Arromanches, deep in the Norman countryside, there is a rather functional looking bridge. It's in fact a remaining section of one of the whale roads. In the aftermath of the Normandy campaign, the Mulberry Harbour was sliced up and used to patch up the French road network. And here, almost 80 years later, it's still performing its job. The Mulberry Harbours are still held up as being a marvel of military engineering, admired the world over. With perhaps the most telling praise of all coming from Nazi architect Albert Speer, who said, "To construct our defences, we had in 2 years used some 13 million cubic metres of concrete and 1.5 million tonnes of steel. A fortnight after the landings by the enemy, this costly effort was brought to nothing because of an idea of simple genius."
Check out the History Hit YouTube, where you can get great exclusive videos and a sneak peek at what's available on the world's best history channel, History Hit TV. It's growing really fast. We're thrilled to have you all aboard.